The chair recognizes Mr. Lawler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing. Very straightforward hearing. During and after the fall of Kabul, examining the administration's emergency evacuation from Afghanistan. This is not a hearing about rehashing 20 plus years worth of policy. This is not a hearing about looking back as to why we went to Afghanistan in the first place. This is not a hearing about decisions made during the war. This is a hearing about the withdrawal and the epic failure of the administration with respect to that withdrawal. Let me say to each and every one of you, on behalf of the American people, I'm sorry. None of you should have been put in that situation. That is a failure of leadership. It is a failure of government. And it is a failure of our military leadership, not you. This should not have happened. For my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have spent the entirety of this hearing trying to figure out a way to not deal with the consequences of these decisions, but to somehow look and try to point fingers at prior administrations. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. The buck stops with him. He had a responsibility. If he disagreed with the prior administration's handling, if he disagreed with the prior administration's plan, fix it. To set a date certain and then move that date up. I was a member of the New York State Legislature. I wasn't in Congress. I watched in horror as planes were taking off and you had people running down the tarmac trying to get on that plane so they could save their lives, the lives of their children, the lives of our service personnel, the lives of people in Afghanistan who worked closely with our men and women in uniform. It is shameful what happened. And as a citizen, not as someone who has served, not as somebody who was on the ground there, as a citizen, it was horrifying to watch. 13 service members dead. Their families gutted. All of you heartbroken. Dealing with the after effects of that. I know as a state representative dealing with our local veterans organizations, the increase in the number of people, veterans who are dealing with PTSD as a result of that, suicide, absolutely shameful. So this is about accountability, this is about transparency, and this is about ensuring this never, ever happens again. There's not one American who should ever be left on the ground in a war zone. And the people who sacrificed so much in Afghanistan to help us, to leave them there, an absolute disgrace. I note, Lieutenant Colonel, in your addendum on women and children, today is International Women's Day. To allow what has transpired since, shameful. All of you are owed a debt of gratitude from your government, from your country, And you are owed, more than anything, the truth. That, hopefully, in part, is what we were able to accomplish with this hearing today. So I thank you for your time and your testimony. God bless you all, and thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your vigilance in pursuing the truth in this committee. And thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your service to our country. And thank you for doing what many in our government did not do, which is to work to help those who helped the United States in our fight against radical Islamic terrorism when we were there in Afghanistan. And some call this a chaotic withdrawal. Others call it an unconditional retreat. However you want to characterize it, it was a disgraceful episode and a failure of leadership to see 13 U.S. service members needlessly killed at H-Kaya because we didn't choose to use Bagram as a better alternative for extraction, and put our young men and women, many Marines, in a terrible situation, and our Afghan allies in a terrible situation, leading to not only leaving behind $7 billion worth of U.S. equipment in the hands of the Taliban, but leaving behind more than 800 American citizens and tens of thousands of our Afghan allies remaining there in jeopardy at the hands of bloodthirsty Taliban enemy after the last U.S. military aircraft departed August 31, 2021. Lieutenant Colonel Mann, this has been asked and probably answered in this lengthy hearing already, but based on your experience in the country, do you think it would have been a more effective plan to execute a withdrawal out of Bagram as opposed to H-Kaya?
Congressman, I do think it would have been more effective and more tenable to utilize Bagram as a platform for NIA.
Mr. Hong, in your testimony, you discussed your efforts to get both Americans and Afghan allies on planes out of Mazar al-Sharif and the fact that it took 3 weeks before they were able to depart. Can you please let this committee know what led to that 3-week delay? Was the Taliban the biggest hurdle? Was the State Department helpful or hurtful? And how were you able to overcome those hurdles?
All those things were hurdles, Congressman. We did not have a adequately sourced plan as far as we could tell. We were operating in conditions that the State Department, frankly, was unsure. Individuals in the State Department unsure of their authorities and their resources. We had to figure out ways to negotiate with the new Taliban government for departure. We managed to overcome those things using, frankly, financial resources, number one. Number two, operational experience of the volunteers gained from hard-earned time on the ground in Afghanistan. And then three, relationships.
Well, I just can't thank you enough for doing, again, what the State Department was not able to do or should have been doing. And finally, I want to read into the record a letter I received from a constituent Marine who served at H-Kaya August 17 to August 31, 2021, and who, because of his experience, ended his active service prematurely. He says, I was an infantry machine gun squad leader, 1st Battalion, 8th Marines Bravo Company. Our company was running security operations in North Gate, H-Kaya. Within my first 2 hours at the gate, I saw Afghan soldiers shooting civilians as a warning for the other civilians to stop trying to overrun our position. Main orders were to keep Afghan civilians under control because of threat of suicide bomber was high. We would have to fight with men, women, and children with non-lethal weapons, firing warnings, shots from our weapons, hand-to-hand combat fighting all day. I watched men step on and kill children to get entry to the airport. I watched women throw their dead children into a sewage canal, where we would also take dead civilians who had died due to injuries sustained by the Taliban. Our chain of a woman handed me her dead infant and asked me to help, but I couldn't. Our chain of command directed us to throw flashbang grenades at civilians to calm them down, and none of us had ever used flashbangs before. My fellow Marines and I were in charge of kicking out, turning away desperate civilians who didn't have proper paperwork. Men, women, and even children would beg my fellow Marines and me to kill them. I had to inform Afghan man with his wife, baby, and multiple children he had to leave. He grabbed my rifle and begged me to kill him and his family because his entire family would be raped and burned alive by the Taliban, and I threw him out. I did everything I could to get them through, but my command told me to kick them out. I hit an older man in the head with a baton on accident, and I saw his head dent and his eyes roll back. I saw a woman get shot in the chest about 10 yards away. I had to fight through the crowd to defend her while our Navy corpsman gave her medical aid. Her crying children were on top of her. I was helping beat people back to make space. A man ran up to me saying it was his sister, and I was so angry I threw the man and jumped on top of him. I was about to hurt him until someone stopped me. Civilians like this man would try to pretend they were family of someone injured, and they were so desperate for understandable reasons. I remember one lady in particular had 2 young daughters dropping to her knees crying and asking us to kill her kids before the Taliban could get to them. Based on procedures put in place by the command, I still had to kick them out. I remember her telling me when her daughters are raped repeatedly, it would be my fault. For this administration, for this White House, for this State Department to put our Marines, like this young constituent of mine, in that position, to put our allies, our Afghan allies in this position, to put our U.S. service members who were killed at HKIA in this position is a disgrace. It is a disgrace. And there needs to be accountability for my Marine constituent who is no longer a Marine. Disgraceful. Thank you all for telling the truth, because the truth that is coming out today because of your testimony, the truth that comes out from my constituent, a brave Marine put in that position, that tells the story of a failure of leadership. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Last but not least, Mr. Nunn's recognized.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and to the Foreign Affairs Committee for having us here today. I want to first off thank the Gold Star families who joined us. I want to thank the veterans who stood up both in Afghanistan and beyond to help save lives. To the civilians, to the volunteers, to our allies across the board, many of us served in Afghanistan, and many more have served on Signal, in chat rooms, and at the wee hours of the morning while doing our main job to help save Americans, our allies, and the future of this country. Specifically, I want to thank Sergeant Vargas. You are a reflection of so many young men and women who went to serve our country in the best way possible. While you manned the post as a sniper, you provided countless hours of overwatch, protecting so many on the ground, including a young man from my district, a Marine, Specialist Deacon Page, who died at Abbey Gate. You knew the right thing to do. Leadership did not empower you to be able to save lives, and that is not on you. Thank you for your service. Beginning on the 26th of August, so many of you in this room, who I see both as friends, as allies, as a band of brothers and sisters who stood up, thank you. When HKIA fell, hundreds of Americans were left outside the wire. Thousands of our friends and allies who had stood with us for decades, putting their life ahead of ours, jeopardizing what their children and their future looked like to make sure we were able to get on those aircraft and fly out. I'm honored to be able to, just this week, honor Major Lunning, who was the last medical nurse to fly out with a group of Americans and Afghans on the C-17 that saved their lives as they traveled to Germany. Unfortunately, hundreds more had to be left behind. I want to tell briefly the story of the Syed family who was at the bombing at Abbey Gate. We first came into contact with them. I've done 3 combat tours, flying recon operations over, and our interpreter, who did 9 combat tours with us, was saved and is now a U.S. citizen in my community back home. But contacting us, they identified that this engineer, a grandfather, who had worked with the U.S. Embassy, who was promised evacuation, who went to Abbey Gate, was hit in the explosion. Despite the fact that he was mangled, the Taliban approached him and they said, "What did you do for the Americans? Why are you leaving our country?" He said, "I'm an engineer. I help build waterways." What is an engineer? I build a future for our country, for our children. They immediately shot him in the leg and left him for dead in the middle of the street in front of his children. Despite this, Mr. Syed walked across an open battlefield to save his 2 young children and his wife and asked for evacuation. We were working an operation at Mazar Sharif at the time, working with CAM Airways. Members who had never met each other, Americans and folks around the world, formed a group called Task Force Argo. And together we were able to get 5 flights out of Mazar Sharif in the north and save 3,000 Afghan allies and 40 Americans on that first flight of 380. But that is only part of the story. The true heroism exists in the faces of each of you in this room, who, despite the fact that you reached out for help from our federal government, you got no answer. Now, Mr. Syed was able to not only navigate a caravan of 40 vehicles north over an 8-hour journey, we asked him, would you please pick up 2 young women whose husband has gone missing? They were students, and on Monday, they were going to university. By the middle of the week, they were beaten in the street because they did not have a head covering. Their future was one of rape and forced marriage. But for Mr. Syed, he put them in the back of his Toyota Corolla with his small children, and together they made this journey north. They were stopped multiple times throughout the night by the Taliban, and they were asked time and time again, who are these women? And he would say, I am their grandfather. We are going to a wedding. But this cover story was not developed out of thin air. It was the work of volunteers who helped at every checkpoint report back on what was going on, who helped provide a clean pathway and made sure that there was a safe harbor when they arrived in Mazar Sharif. And over the course of the next weeks that turned into months, flight after flight saved these individuals. There are many of you who are on this panel today, and I cannot thank you enough. This digital Dunkirk, this rescue from Afghanistan, is a direct reflection of what you did to save these lives, the lives of people who'd spent decades saving ours. So with that, France, I want to first of all commend you and everything that you did to help evacuate with your team and the hundreds of volunteers behind the scenes, not just here, but around the world who did that. I want to speak specifically to the issue of flying folks out of Mazar Sharif. Was the U.S. State Department or the Taliban the harder force in being able to get those aircraft off the ground and save those lives?
They were equally hard, Congressman. I mean, in both cases, both were operating from a place of confusion, of lack of information, and lack of authority. Literally, both sides of the government coin.
Adrian, I'd like to speak to you on what the U.S. government's. Was there ever a single point of contact within State Department that you could reach out to, that you had the ability to, Colonel, to actually have a conversation to seek evacuation?
There was not, Congressman, really, that we ever found. What we found that worked very well was Aiden's unit in particular was very responsive and looking to do more, and they had what seemed to be a very good working relationship with State Department at Apron 8 for out processing. So we really relied on them to do that. We could never figure out how to do that direct engagement.
And, France, you talk about a moral obligation that we have. Is there also a national security implication for what has occurred?
Congressman, when we left Afghanistan, we not only left behind allies, we left behind our honor. We left behind our credibility. If we want allies to fight alongside us in the future, we need to be credible when we tell them that we're going to stand by them. We need the strategic option of working by, with, and through allies in the future. And without the credibility that comes from standing by the allies in Afghanistan, we're not going to get that cooperation in future fights. And then we're going to have to either choose as a nation to be less effective on the global stage or choose to spend more of America's blood and treasure to achieve the same outcomes.
France, thank you. Mr. Chair, my appreciation, because what was our darkest hour in Afghanistan is made better by the actions that each of you took to be able to save lives and chart a better course for our country. We on this panel owe it to you to be able to get answers and truth so this never happens again. With that, Mr. Chair, thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Before I close, I'd like to recognize the ranking member for any comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first thank all of our esteemed witnesses for appearing before our committee today. And I said it once and I say it again. Let me really thank you also for saving and evacuating over 120,000 people in 17 days under the most difficult conditions imaginable in a complex and dangerous environment thousands of miles away. I want to thank you. There were successes in this evacuation, and there were mistakes. We need to acknowledge both. I want to particularly thank and also commend all of you who work to help not only our Afghan allies and partners, but also for being advocates for the rights and pathways of refugees and immigrants more broadly. Ms. Mackler, your work in particular, including for coordinating legal services for those impacted by the Muslim ban in my own district at JFK Airport, lays bare how much more work we need to do in Congress to fix our broken immigration system. And as I said in my opening remarks again, extricating ourselves from 2 decades of a quagmire in Afghanistan was always going to be a difficult task. And I believe that we are deluding ourselves if we believe that this could have been as an easy operation given the deteriorating security situation and rapidly changing events on the ground that no one could have predicted. This undertaking was further complicated by sets of policies, and these are just facts, policy decisions made by the previous administration that altered the balance of power in Afghanistan and hindered our ability to honor our commitment to thousands of brave Afghans who stood side by side with us over the course of the past 2 decades. And yes, I must say that I am deeply concerned by some of my colleagues who paint the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan with such broad strokes as to divorce the emergency evacuation from those choices and the full context that led up to the events in August 2021. They don't stand, that doesn't happen in a vacuum and by itself. I believe we must commit ourselves to responsible, bipartisan oversight, and we must ensure that we are taking a sober look at how we reached this outcome in Afghanistan after 20 years of war. But we also must look at how we can prevent the same mistakes from going and being made again going forward. And yet, under the most challenging circumstances, you, along with our diplomats and intelligence professionals, mobilized this whole of government effort to evacuate American citizens. There are important lessons to be learned from mistakes that were made. Yet the impossible has also happened. Due to your tireless work, the State Department and other U.S. government personnel, lives were saved. And I couldn't help but feel, as I said at the beginning, when I think of all, and I think we need to recognize and honor all 2,461 members of the United States military that lost their lives during this 20 years of war. And as I close and yield back, I just want to, because I just was reflecting, ask unanimous consent, being a member from New York, I just wanted to put in the record the names of the 112 members of the United States military that lost their lives in this war that came from my state of New York. To the Gold Star families here, and to those that may be listening, to those that I have met and talked to in regards to the 20 years, including the evacuation, my heart, my prayers, my soul reaches out to you. And those of us that sits in the United States Congress, we also take the responsibility that we have to pass the legislation that we need to do to make sure that this does not happen again. With that unanimous consent, I ask for these.
And without objection.